history war, from coercive colonialism to inclusive culture. That's the origin of American culture war, since Japanese imperialism times. The Ministry of Korean Foreign Affairs said that the claim that Sea of Japan is the only internationally recognized name is not true, and that we will continue to present our position to the international community. Based on the English version released in September, this video was produced in 9 languages, including Korean, Chinese, and Spanish. It is interpreted as an intention to wage an international public opinion battle using the diplomatic missions of each country. Wokes shout, "Oh my God, the US is new normal." She made drug decriminalized and the sexual offenders decriminalized, an advanced, tech-savvy trendsetting nation, sparkling democracy, UK journos brainwash, not to invade Korean sovereignty. But we are against nationalism. Japan imperialists tried to completely distort or obliterate Korean history in order to justify their aggression, colonial rule. Japan imperialism denied autonomy and *originality of Korean history with colonialists that insisted on *heteronomy, identity, and *partisanship. Korean history Pyeonsu Hyo established by Gov General of Korea took lead in distorting history, based on the colonialist view. Japan tried to create an obedient colonial humanoid by implementing discriminatory colonial education in reality, advocating assimilation on the surface. Starting with Korean 3.1 movement, Japan changed its course from coercive truce politics to a more relaxed cultural politics. But, the inside of Japan imperialisms, which was soft on the outside, became more maleficent. Japan began to divide the nation by raising pro-Japanese. Starting with Korea's division, the U.S. media changes chorus, from "But Japan, war criminal state, sexual crimes of girls is more decriminalized" by U.S. Governor Rashid began to divide Koreans by dictated by pro-Japanese. The youth of Koreans will surely fall into disappointment and vainness about all the characters and history of their own country. Saito Magoto, Governor General of Chosun Dynasty, encouraged the compilation of distortion of Korean history. In 1919, Park Kyung-hee wrote, "I sometimes give advice to young people. Do not be polite to the Japanese. It is easy to be misunderstood as a flattering obedience, and then Japanese try to step on you. There's no future for Japan, where is forgotten their history. Don't treat the Japanese to a well-prepared meal. They don't have this culture, nor room in mind. And weigh their strength in the table rather than accepting the sincerity of the other person." It was a few years ago. An editor-in-chief of a Japanese magazine visited. I remember that he said, "It was the misfortune of us and the Korean people to have Japan as a neighbor. As long as Japan bothers its neighbors, Koreans are bound to be nationalists. It is only when Japan does not cause conflicts and threats that we will set us free from the nation and join hands as human beings. And there is no need for nationalism." However, some intellectuals who novelize the logic of the past powerhouse implied by pro-Jap criticism will, of course, deny it. Some people who are very superficial about the disappearance of the territorial concept after World War II can laugh at concerns about Japan, move to the international world. Feel nationalism dwarfed in view of globalism, and the problem may be the insidiousness or fantasy of Japan. However, I am not saying to talk about some trends before that. It does not mean that we should emotionally consider our Korean culture for neglect. What kind of insight should I say? I began to grab a pen because of it. And subtle enlightenment was led me into the quagmire of time buried in the old days. What kind of insight should I say, or a series of suspicions rather than insight, is right? Nevertheless, it is Korean common emotion and perception, regardless of generation, that we have been unilaterally beaten by Japan. So, our resentment is bound to be unilateral. The bones of hatred bitten in a conscious place are difficult to extract. But at some point, I began to feel that they had a grudge against us as well. The idea that perhaps the resentment deep in their consciousness is older and greater. It's not that we hasn't harmed Japan, passed on a valuable culture, laid the foundation for the country. And no reason to have a grudge. I also thought that Japanese potential sense of inferiority in the past would destroy our Korean national culture. I also thought quite generously of the attributes of the conqueror. However, Japanese persistence was not sufficiently explained by volition of inferiority or the nature as the conqueror. Japan neglects Korean culture with the logic of the strong. Culture is a value that cannot be measured with a ruler and cannot be measured with scales, so it is time to properly look at the sharp blade, strife, hidden inside the Japanese. Japan's expansionism is no different from the past. The evil is no different. The idealism or intelligence of some intellectuals who show criticism or indifference to nationalism. I see as intellectual vanity, she wrote. Equally, the sovereignty of a nation imposes higher obligations with respect to the sovereignty nature of diplomatic powers transfer from the return of wartime opcon than those conferred on national beliefs. Protected by the Constitution. Don't you admit it? Just by inserting a bigot word, would she know the history of Asian tragedy? Just as there is a culture of jung in Korea. Our national history cannot be encompassed by the fragmented individualism of West as one uniformed frame. Even if it is ethnic. There is a unique culture called jung that cannot be found in any other country. It is a unique language, which is difficult to find in any other country and difficult to replace with other languages. It is also the reason why others don't have the culture. How much does the U.S. scholar know about Eastern literature in the West? Or does she know where Korea is located? What about Dokdo, East Sea of Korea? Anthropologists who do not know why it is called latitude, or the cause of it, but only talk about the colony with a benevolent gaze, in fact. She is just West ideological idealist who has forgotten that the anthropological developmental studies that emerged from imperialism are just a derivative category of white eugenics that is no different from the colonial view. Because Japan betrayed East communities with the West on its back, she has become a difficult country for intellectuals to exist. The list of plausible so-called Western scholars' unilateral rhetoric is only in English, and calling or naming Dokdo, Korea's indigenous territory. The US, UK, and Japan call Dokdo, by another name, is a clear violation of sovereignty. It must not be replaced with any pronoun. Whenever those Westerners glance at here, it seems plausible to see the overwhelmingly high intellectual vanity in the shallow level of knowledge of the great, who could not even introduce themselves in Korean added, Park Kyung-ri wrote. Japan, where the God lives, I get embarrassed when I see the timid Japanese. How did they invade and slaughter? However, the Japanese are basically weak in power and have the attribute of worshipping the strong. Soldier Watanabe wrote, a living person is set up for boot camp. And dozens of recruits charge one after another. There is nothing on earth that is as precious as human life. Most Japanese intellectuals regard Korean resentment as boring, unpleasant and bothersome. Considering that the colonial view still remains as militarism, but rather economically, focusing only on the pursuit of profit. Arbitrarily altering the truth and using it as an advantage poses more risks than not being the truth. The national anthem of Korea is filled with national aspirations that contain national sentiment. The East Sea and Mount Baekdu. To the opposite, Japan Kimigeo sings only the kings and commanders, pebbles, rocks, moss. The future is opened by reflection on past. Why humans need memory, record. Whether intended or not, forgetting can't conceive hope. In darkness from even light cannot escape. What will sprout and speak of hope for the future?